Well, good afternoon, everybody. We'd like to welcome you to the seventh edition of the Praxis webinar series. My name is Trent Oliver. I'm Principal and Managing Director of Blue Telescope. Blue Telescope is an award-winning boundary-pushing team that has collaborated with world-class museums to bring ideas, stories, and human connection to every touch point, thus expanding the human experience. This afternoon, I'm your moderator for the webinar, so you'll hear from me for a bit and then I'll be quiet. So for all of you who are unfamiliar with Praxis, we're a museum professionals network whose members are seasoned professionals working at the top of our industry. We get together, we share ideas, best practices, new techniques, new technologies. We are all practitioners working in many aspects of museum projects, from conception and master planning, content creation, lighting, media, communications, to construction and operations. So with our combined network stretching across both the country and the industry, we provide a powerful resource to you as you contemplate the many aspects of your project. Our audience and clientele are museum leaders, exhibit designers, and architects, all vested in creating thoughtful, engaging, state-of-the-art, and timely museum experiences. Today's webinar is in support of our mission to provide compelling information, open a dialogue with our community, and move forward together as we dip a toe into the realm of the post-COVID-19 world. So some of you who just joined missed my little opening, but a little bit of housekeeping. The presentation is about 30 minutes, followed by a question and answer period that I will moderate. Please mute your microphone for the duration of the webinar, and please use the Zoom chat room feature to pose any questions you would like our presenters to address, and I will do my best to get them all answered. So with that, let's get started. Today, we bring you Stephen Rosen and Tony Warner. Stephen is the founder and president of Available Light, a renowned lighting firm with extensive experience in museum exhibition and architecture. Listen, create, deliver. It are these three words that drive the company. Mr. Rosen's commitment to responsible design is central to his international award-winning work. He is a fellow of the International Association of Lighting Designers and is an active member in both IALD and the Illuminating Engineering Society. Stephen serves on the faculty of FIT's graduate program in exhibit and experience design. Sorry, my dog just found something. Tony is a founder and president of Phase Shift Consulting, a technology design firm specializing in audiovisual, telecommunications, and security systems design in the built environment. Recognized as one of the top audiovisual solution companies by CIO Review, Phase Shift leverages past performance on some of the most iconic projects around the world. A former president of Avixa and a recent board member of the Integrated Systems Europe, Tony has played an active role in shaping strategic direction of the industry around the globe. And with that, I give you Stephen and Tony.
Thanks, Trent.
Well, thank you, Trent. Tony, I guess I'll lead off here, and you'll
Sounds good.
Quickly jump in. How cool is it to see all these people come to learn a little bit about planning some infrastructure for your institute?
They have no idea what they're in for. No.
Hopefully you'll learn a lot of things. I know that having worked with Tony on this, I've already learned a number of things from Tony, so I'm excited for all of you today. So one of the reasons that we created Praxis is that each of us has a very unique skill. We are well known for what we do. We have a very deep experience in what we do. And we felt that by coming together, we could share everything from what's going on in the industry to sharing information with you all, the people that we serve and the people that we work with, about how to build a better museum and how to create a better visitor experience. We have worked very hard to master what we work at. And I'm a firm believer in the fact that the stronger your technical skills, you really get the gift of creative freedom. And so that's what this is, that to us, that's what Praxis is all about and why we came together. So Tony, why don't you lead us off?
Sure. So throughout this presentation, we're going to talk through various project considerations pertaining to lighting and technology. Some of them big picture, some more technical. But before we get into any of that, I think it's important that we step back and ask why. What are our objectives? Why does Stephen and I do what we do? Why do you all care enough about these topics to be here today? Paul, if you want to advance to the next slide. So I believe that why we do what we do comes down to these things, because technology and lighting can help to tell old stories in new ways. We help to enhance the experience. Certainly we attract attention, hopefully in good ways. We complement architecture in creating seamless aesthetics. And lastly, and I think this is probably the most important one, we help to leave lasting impressions. And it's all about the user experience. And that's really why we do what we do. So with that as our lens, we're going to touch on the following topics today. If we go to the next slide. Unlike some trades, both lighting and technology interact heavily with both museum's base building architecture and the exhibits. On some projects, we're involved in both. On other projects, we may be involved in just one. So we're going to touch on the importance of harmonizing those. As we all know, some museum projects can span many years. We'll talk through when the best time is to engage lighting and technology as part of that conversation. We also know that space is a premium today on most buildings, and probably especially so in museums. Do we still need to have support space for those systems, or is that no longer needed? We're going to look at that. And then last, we're going to touch on smart buildings. We hear a lot about smart technology, the Internet of Things in all facets of our life. And should that really be part of our design strategy?
So I don't have to tell you all this because you came here today, but pre-planning is hard work. It requires vision, tenacity, focus, collaboration, creativity. And the more that you engage all of those attributes, the more successful is going to be your project. And we've learned a lot along the way. Sometimes an owner or a museum board hires an architect to craft some sort of iconic building that is going to be the center of a community or the center of a city that's going to draw attention to its organization. Sometimes the board hires an exhibit designer first and begins to craft this experience from the inside and then working to the outside, to the envelope. We firmly believe that the most successful projects are the one that engage both architect and exhibit designer in close proximity to one another. The give and take that happens between those two parties, the architect wanting to create the envelope and something that's going to attract people, the exhibit designer focused on the story, the content, and the lessons that are to be learned inside. And the more that those two groups can work together, the more successful will be the mission of the museum to deliver the content and the experience that they're looking forward to. So what we're really looking forward is what we're looking forward to is creating a visitor experience that's par excellence. Next slide, Paul. So one of the things that we have learned over the years, and maybe some of you have seen a chart like this before, but a very true maxim is that the cost of change is inversely proportional to the amount of time you have remaining to finish the project. I often refer to the early phases, master planning and schematic design, as the honeymoon period. You can fall in and out of love a million times. You can try a bunch of different ideas. You can talk through anything. You can head for the moon. You can reach for the stars. You can talk about all that is possible. And as you, I think of the design process as a funnel. And so as you get closer and closer to that GMP package, that final documentation package, the more you are jettisoning all the ideas that no longer make sense to the mission, and you're funneling down to your final piece. But to keep in mind that the closer you get to the end of the project, the more expensive it is to change things. And I think we all could tell a story about where we've been on a project and an owner or an architect or an exhibit designer or a lighting designer came in and said, oh, this is a mistake. We need to move this column. And I think we all know that the cost to move a column that's already been cast in concrete and put inside the building is a relatively expensive endeavor. So what Tony and I are trying to emphasize today is that change is complicated, it's expensive as you move down the funnel towards the end, and why we think it's important to engage experts who have a lot of experience and can help you see around corners as you're planning your project. Oftentimes the fees that consultants charge are a drop in the bucket when you're faced with your first change order from a contractor. We can move on, Paul.
So along those lines, when is the best time to think about lighting and technology? As I mentioned earlier, some projects can span many years. We're involved in a project right now that it is slated to open to the public in 2027. So it's a pretty long time. This next slide is, well, I'm not sure I've ever heard it stated as this. Many times there seems to be a notion that it's okay to wait till the later stages of design to engage lighting and technology. We believe, however, that even though there's much bigger considerations early on, that there are still many benefits to having lighting and technology seated at the table early on in a project, certainly during schematic design and possibly even during concepts.
Oh,
move on.
Sure, let's move on. Sorry. So let's talk a little bit about the things that, as a lighting designer, the things that we consider when we are thinking about building a job or putting a job together or designing the infrastructure for a job. The most important word in our vocabulary, of course, is visibility. Most people get the vast majority of their sensory input from their eyes. And so providing illumination and making sure that people know where to look and what's important is the #1 topic for consideration as a lighting designer. But where it gets interesting, or where it might even get a little artsy, is how we decide to locate that lighting, where we're going to put the lighting, and how we're going to reveal any number of things that are in a space. And that all comes from this very important word, contrast. Everything that we perceive by contrast, whether it's dark to light or loud to soft or sweet to salty, from texture to smooth. All of these different concepts, all of these competing concepts are what give us contrast and allow us to understand the world around us. So from very early on, when we're working with a team, whether it's with an architect or an exhibit designer or both, we are often talking about the contrast experience and how we as lighting designers can help in the design, the early design for delivering that kind of content. Light is a form giver, and if you have a beautiful Greek statue in your museum, the lighting designer can make that statue look very, very flat and dull, or they can make it look dynamic and invigorating. And it's all about where they place the lights and how they orchestrate contrast. And finally, we think a lot about sustainability, and that's a big word, and it's a bit of a buzzword in the 21st century, but it is an incredibly important word from a number of points of view. First would be sustainability in the terms, from my point of view, as a way of conserving energy. We are constantly trying to eke out light for less and less consumption of electricity. We use this metric of watts per square foot. How much light are we consuming? How much energy are we consuming to create light? And can we create the same light using less energy? Thanks very much to the LED revolution, our lives changed enormously about 10 years ago. And it's been a bumpy road, having changed from legacy sources like tungsten halogen to LEDs, but we've reached a point in the technology now where it's pretty reliable. And even creating control systems has become a little bit easier to do. And we're really excited about the possibilities that LED innovation continues to provide to the design of buildings. Another way we think about conservation is the use of what's going to happen to our systems after they're no longer in use. A system might be 15 or 20 or 30 years old. An owner decides to reconceive a gallery into something completely different, and a lot of the equipment that was in that gallery is no longer necessary. So we are constantly thinking about the equipment we specify and its cradle to grave implications, where it is going to go when it leaves the building and gets thrown into a landfill or gets recycled. Europe is way ahead of America in its legislation of using electronic parts that can be recyclable and don't have nasty chemicals or adhesives in them. But America's catching up, and it's certainly something that a lot of designers think about when they specify their systems. And the last thing I think about when I use the word sustainability is the conservation of delicate museum objects. That is also creating a sustainable environment for what we're presenting to the public, not only for today, but for generations to come. So critical to this discussion today is how the pre-production process is going to be affected by the choices that we make and by some of these words I've just discussed with you. Tony? Oh, no, Stephen. So the benefits of early engagement. Well, the first thing that happens, and I've already made mention of this, is the fact that when we are brought into a project early, when the consultant team is brought in early, it's much easier to influence modifications to architectural and exhibit frameworks. So as the exhibit designers and architects are working, if we can be right alongside with them, we can ask questions like, well, if the building was set back another 14 inches, then we could light the facade a certain way. If the exhibit was not quite as tall as that, the lighting fixtures would be able to fit in the space without interrupting the plane of the top of the exhibit. Very simple concepts, but if we're brought in during CD, it's already too late to say to the architect, can you move the building in 14 inches? So these are really important early considerations.
In a little bit, we're going to talk about equipment support spaces, if we still need them or not. In situations where we do, though, the earlier we can be part of that conversation, the better, in identifying how large they need to be, how many there need to be, where they should be. The earlier we can do that, it's far less disruptive to architecture, to Stephen's point. Infrastructure planning, how do we get from point A to point B? Especially in museums that involve historic architecture, that can be really challenging. And the earlier we can start that conversation, again, the less disruptive it is to the overall project. Budget planning is the big one for everybody. And as we all know, I mean, lighting and technology systems, they can vary widely. They can range all over the map. We want to help support your budget planning process from the earliest stages of the project. Stephen and I both know what our systems are supposed to, what they cost. And we're really good at like helping you to start at a big picture and kind of focus that down as the project progresses. And also that allows us also to adapt our design as needed to meet the desired budget goals as well.
Another thing that we consider early on in the process is power consumption. In order for electrical engineers to begin to do their work, planning, sizing of HVAC ducts and cooling systems, et cetera, we need to be able to track energy consumption. Paul, could you go to the next slide? And in fact, the last 2 points the last point that Tony talked about, and then I just mentioned, it is incredibly important to a lighting designer to basically track two very important metrics through the process, starting from early master planning all the way through to construction documents. We are constantly tracking both financial budgets, how much the equipment that we're specifying is going to cost, and we're also tracking energy consumption. So at any time, our clients can call us on the phone and ask, do a check-in, like where are we with our two budgets? And clearly one might affect the other. So we are constantly monitoring this, really a great tool for us. Tony?
So I realize this slide's, it's very detailed and it's hard to read clearly. That's not the point. I just wanted to put it up just to show some engineering studies that we did on a recent project that influenced a significant change in the direction of the various media concepts. So the initial concept was to blanket like an entire ceiling of an atrium with projection mapping. It was super cool. The renderings looked great. The whole team was excited about the concept. So we got to work studying that. But after working through the engineering details, it was determined that the architectural requirements to mount the projectors, on top of the fact that the cost estimate was up there, both those factors tended to be showstoppers. So the whole design team early in the process was able to pivot and head in a different direction. As a result, the architect was able to design a completely different ceiling structure. And on the AV side, we were able to refocus our attention onto a large LED video wall as the primary element instead. So while the visitor experience and the impact of lighting and technology is the most obvious part of what we do, a less exciting but equally important part is all the equipment that makes it happen behind the scenes that no one else sees. What do we do with that? Are equipment racks still needed? Are equipment rooms still needed? So this is meant to be a silly slide, but unfortunately, sometimes it's not too different from reality. If we were all together in the same room, I'd ask everybody to put their hand up if you've ever seen a room like this with equipment in it, and I suspect that most of us would have our hands up. Unfortunately, it's more the norm than the exception. But no, it's not a good idea to hang equipment on the wall in storage closets like this. It's much preferable to, if we go to the next slide, we do often still need an equipment room. And why do we need an equipment room? Well, I just wanted to list out some of the key benefits in our mind. The first one is it's cheaper and for power, for UPS backup, and for cooling to co-locate all of that equipment in the same place. By doing that, it also allows us oftentimes to condition the air in that room, and potentially extending the life expectancy of the equipment in there. PoE, a power over Ethernet. This is a big one today. A lot of equipment is getting powered via that. Small pieces of equipment that might be out in galleries. But the switches that provide that power are often large enterprise grade switches that really belong in an organized equipment room. Perhaps one of the biggest ones in my mind is it's by having everything in one place, it makes it much easier to be organized for technicians. They can get in that space, service the equipment, maintain it without having to go into the gallery and disrupting visitors. It's all behind the scenes. Having said all that, we do oftentimes on projects today find ourselves kind of in this hybrid environment where we have a mix of dedicated equipment rooms with racked equipment. And then we also have like smaller local devices out at the edge at the galleries. So, yeah.
I was going to say, I love working with Tony because very often planning equipment rooms, you're kind of the boogeyman, right? Nobody wants to give you the square footage for these equipment rooms, no matter how important they are. And then I usually come in and just say, hey, can I just put a few things in your room, Tony? So it always works out well for the lighting designer.
We're doing your dirty work for you.
That's right.
So there are times when equipment rooms can be avoided. And when are those? It's when a technology can be easily contained within the actual exhibit, doesn't really connect with broader systems throughout the facility, in situations where the media and lighting elements are simple and isolated. The next slide, we see a good example where a kiosk display might have one or two devices mounted behind the display. You can see there, it's neat, it's organized. There's really not a great reason to, locate those pieces of equipment elsewhere remotely. They can be right there and they're easily accessible. The next slide, on the other hand, shows a situation where there clearly is too much to go behind a display. We can see here, this is not easily serviceable, and it's far from being reliable. So we need to judge it on a case-by-case basis. This is a situation where it probably would have been better to locate this equipment remotely into a separate room. So now that we looked at support spaces, there's another key aspect of design, again, behind the scenes, that should be considered early in the project. It's the infrastructure. And that involves Stephen's systems on the lighting side, involves mine on the technology side. I like to think of it, in many ways, it's akin to the central nervous system. It's what makes everything work. We don't see it, but it's critical to what we do. So I'm often asked when we start talking about infrastructure, I'm often asked today, well, do we even need wires anymore? Isn't everything wireless? And the answer is, and it's a great question, the answer is kind of, sort of. If we can go to the next slide, wireless can absolutely be a component of our infrastructure strategy, but in our minds, it shouldn't be the only one. And it still often requires wires to go with it. We generally need power at the exhibits. So if we need power at the exhibits, then why not also run data? Wireless still has similar space and infrastructure requirements, whether it's wire going to a wireless access point, or whether it's space behind equipment to locate receivers, things like that. Performance is not always, but it's often more limited than a hardwired connection. There's higher risk of reliability issues. And I think this is something we all relate to on a daily basis. We work with our cell phones constantly, and we've come accustomed to knowing that dropouts are just a way of life at times. It's no different with other wireless technologies. So it's not 100% reliable. None of those are showstoppers by any means. And my only point is that in our mind, it's prudent to still, if we're going to deploy a wireless solution, it's prudent to do that alongside of wired and not rely completely on wireless. I think in situations where we do decide to roll out a wireless solution, it's the earlier in the project, again, this goes back to early involvement, the earlier we can start to work through that, the better. We can identify other wireless systems in the building that might provide interference. We can also look at what's appropriate antenna placement to have seamless coverage. So all of that said, yes, wireless can be a component. We believe that it probably is best served when it lives beside a wired infrastructure as well.
So everything that Tony just said, including the great metaphor about these systems being the central nervous system of an institution, is true for lighting. Whether we're talking about PoE or we're talking about wireless or distributed control, whatever that is, there are many, many parallels between what the two of us do. So rather than be redundant, I want to expand on that a little bit. I've had the opportunity to work with a client who has developed a very cool system that I'm very fond of. A lot of the work we do at Available Light is permanent installation work. Permanent meaning, decades in existence, an exhibit that's going to be there for a long time. And when we are doing that kind of work, we have a lot of freedom to design systems and mounting positions, and basically the whole approach to the lighting design can be very much tailored to the look and style and feel of that particular unique exhibit installation. However, as you all know, there are many instances where a gallery is used over and over and over again for multiple uses and for multiple kinds of presentations. And this system that I'm going to share with you is something I think you should all be thinking about. On the left photo shows a standard changing exhibits gallery, or a gallery in a museum. And if you just kind of zoom in into the middle photograph and then to the top right photograph, you'll see that built into the track system are a series of Ethernet or RJ45 connections. And you would think that, oh, well, that's for plugging in networking equipment or maybe a wireless hub. But in fact, if you could go to the next slide, Paul. In fact, those RJ45s go back to a patch panel back in one of Tony's control rooms. Thank you, Tony. And in that rack is the ability to make those RJ45s be a number of different serve a number of different applications, everything from digital lighting control to sending a video signal or an audio signal, running Ethernet if you're trying to network computers together on the museum floor. You can plug in sensors. So if we are trying to track when people are coming up to a case with a sensitive object in it, we put up a motion sensor so that if no one's looking at that object, why are the lights on? So the sensor will tell the system to dim the lights at that case. You might have security cameras, or if you have interactivity in your museum and perhaps guests are pushing buttons or gesturing or doing some other way to interact with an exhibit or an experience, that too can be home run back into the control closet with this flexible system. So, and you can even have thermostats and other kinds of cooling temperatures and sensors on hooked into this system. So you can see it's enormously flexible. So if you have a building and a gallery that's going to be used for a lot of different things, I would urge you to think about this. There are a couple of publications I would like to share with you that I think would be good for you to have on your shelf if you're at all involved with the planning of systems for museums. And I'm actually going to put these on a link in the chat room. Hopefully that went up to everybody. The first publication that I want to draw your attention to is called IES TM23, which is a technical memorandum on control systems. As you can see on the right side of the slide, there are as many technical lighting digital protocols as the day is long. Some of them are wireless, some of them are wired, some of them are 0 to 10 volts, some of them are digital. But when you're making choices early on in the design process of your institution and the backbone of your institution, having a good sense of what these things mean can be incredibly helpful. On a topic that is probably more near and dear to your hearts, this next slide introduces you to another publication called IES RP30, or Recommended Practice. Paul, could you advance one more time? Thank you. Inside this publication are a whole host of chapters that one by one deal with building the infrastructure for your museum. Everything from early planning and concept planning, talking about conservation, control systems, hardware, daylight integration. It's a really terrific publication that I think you'll find really helpful to have in your library.
And Stephen, you contributed to that, correct?
I did. Available. I actually wrote the chapter on design in this book. Thanks, Tony. Let's move on. Thank you. So another thing that we think about when we're in the schematic design process is developing maximum flexibility in the way that we're going to install lighting into the building. If we're part of the team that's hired by the exhibit designer, and the exhibit designer is brought in late in the process of designing the building, we often find it's difficult to figure out ways to integrate lighting positions and exhibit hanging positions into the existing framework or the envelope of the building. Can you go one more forward, Paul? Let me just zoom in here a little bit. So this illustration just talks a little bit about the time we spend thinking about the details of how we're going to install track into a building or pipe or mounting positions. And the earlier that we can integrate this into the architect's package, we'll likely get it into the GMP package, which means that when the building goes out to bid to be built, a lot of the exhibit hanging infrastructure will be part of the bones of the building. This saves the client an enormous amount of money. Tony?
So since it's a common topic in design these days, we thought we'd take a few minutes just to touch on this last topic, smart buildings, or Internet of Things, as it's often referred to. So what is a smart building? If we go to the next slide, this is how I get my arms around it. I guess personally, I view it as it's the integration of disparate systems to do one or several of these three things. So optimize efficiencies. It's all about sustainability. Stephen spoke about sustainability earlier. How are we better stewards of our facility and our environment? Also, enhance user experience. This is wellness. So this is not just wellness of visitors, also wellness of employees. And then lastly, streamline operations. This is the financial part. How do we realize efficiency? How do we improve our return on investment, our total cost of ownership? But really, when it boils down to it, those are the three primary motivators for really embarking into the smart building realm. We could spend a great deal of time talking about this topic, hours. But essentially, smart buildings and the Internet of Things are about connecting many different disparate systems to leverage functionality that none of them would have individually on their own. I like this mind map. Again, it's very detailed. More just wanted the big picture of it. But what I like about it is that it visually tries to convey just one part of this broad interconnected web of disparate systems. On the project that this was for, this was just one of these mind maps. There were also like 4 others, and they were kind of built around these nexus points of core systems that kind of needed to control a lot of other smaller systems. Really, smart buildings doesn't necessarily mean an entirely new system. It does mean creating new connection points between systems during design and during implementation, perhaps most importantly, during operations. Systems that historically have maybe been siloed. And to Stephen's point earlier, most of those connections leverage the data network. So we find ourselves in a very central role in these conversations when we start talking about smart building technology.
You know, one of the things that I have seen happen in planning process is when you look at this mind map diagram, someone who's not thinking about holistically about how a building works, how systems work in harmony with one another, and how people actually operate a facility. I've seen all of the green boxes, which are the layer out from the main building management system, integrated into the building management system so that there's one sort of giant computer controlling everything on its own. And I very quickly and always discourage my clients from doing that. There are times when you need to have individual control systems for different parts of the infrastructure of a building for any host of reasons, which starts with the commissioning of the building when it's brand new. Say the lighting people are there to focus the lights, but the people who are running the building management system are 1,000 miles away and unavailable. All of a sudden, the lighting people don't have a way to turn their lights on. So it starts right at the beginning of a project, but runs all the way through to the life of the project in terms of troubleshooting, reporting, upgrades, firmware upgrades. So I'm a big fan of a building management system sending simple commands out to a distributed network of controllers that then handle the hard work of running their specific task. I'll go on to the next slide. You know, all of us that are on this call today really are very privileged to work on the kinds of projects that we get to do. Whenever I talk to my colleagues about lighting design in general, they always say, "Oh, you're so lucky, you're the museum guy." And I have to tell you, they're right. It is a privilege to be able to do this kind of work. And so we often have to come back to, what about the artifacts? How are we going to protect the artifacts so that for 100 years from now, people can still enjoy them? And although this is not a lighting issue, it is something I think about all the time and bring to the attention of the people on my team. And that is things like relative humidity, protecting cases from dust, and keeping things constant. Objects like things to be constant. They like the temperature to be constant, the humidity to be constant, the light exposure to be constant. The more that you can bring equilibrium to these spaces, the better they're going to serve the public today and the better they're going to serve the public in the future. So that pretty much wraps up Tony's and my conversation with you today. Again, just what we think about all the time, and we hope you are going to think about more if you haven't already, is that nexus between architecture and exhibits and why it's so important when you're planning your exhibit. And with that, I guess I will turn it back to Trent. Thank you. If we have Trent. Well, why don't we, I haven't been looking at I think her dog must have knocked over
No,
I did see one question in the
I'm
chat
here.
that I think's
Nope,
probably
nope. Sorry, I have it. I just lost my mouse there for a second. So a question that we have in the chat was, when scoping out, when you're designing wireless from the start, what do you do differently to incorporate a robust wireless system versus wired?
Sure. Good question. Well, I think it's important to identify how many systems in the facility are going to be operating wirelessly, and then to understand what protocols those are using. For instance, are they using 802.11 like the standard Wi-Fi, or are they using like a proprietary? A lot of the systems use proprietary wireless technology, and we need to look at the frequencies that those ride on and make sure that there's not interference, especially in projects where we're in a larger urban environment, like New York, for instance. There's so much wireless activity just out in society that is potentially going to interfere, that we just need to look at all of that stuff and take that into account, perhaps in the frequency selection that we're doing. So there's that piece. And then it's just like Wi-Fi, like say at your house or in your office. We need, where we locate, wireless requires antennas. It requires antennas or access points, whatever we want to call them. And where those are located needs to be strategic. And they're definitely impacted. Well, I mentioned earlier historic buildings, especially buildings that have a lot of stone material and things like that. They're not friendly to wireless signals. So we need to take all that into account and be strategic about where we're locating those devices, how we're getting to those, and things like that. In really extreme situations, we can do wireless propagation studies early on. Those often aren't done on museum projects. But yeah, there's a lot of wireless planning that goes in, should go in, I think. And it's not to say that the system can't work if we don't do it early on, but we can do it better and more strategically, I think, the earlier we kind of plan for some of that.
And more economically.
Exactly. Yep.
That's great. Carolyn Harris has asked, can you talk a little bit about how to delineate between architecture, building lighting, and tech and exhibit during the early and later process? Seems like it can get pretty tricky.
It can get tricky. It can get political with people kind of staking out turf. But in fact, the idea would be for the visitor to not understand or even notice a difference between the experience in a lobby, through the corridors, into a cafe or a shop, and into the galleries. The more holistic, the more it is consistent, the better the experience. And so where it gets tricky, especially, is when, as I've said earlier, when you engage these two teams in vastly different ways, or for whatever reason you keep them separated, they don't talk to each other. The communication between those two is critical. So very often we are hired to light the exhibits in a building, in a gallery or in a museum. And we're working for the exhibit designer, and the architect has hired a different lighting designer. The good news is that the architectural lighting design community is relatively small. We almost all know each other. And there are plenty of times when I can pick up the phone and call the architectural lighting designer and have a conversation about scope, crossover. Are there going to be exhibits, especially dynamic or interactive exhibits, in a public space like in a lobby? How can we work together to make sure that we are protecting our clients? Because that's a big part of what we do, is protect our clients. So communication is the way to deal with that, to make sure that not only are the two systems playing nicely together in terms of technical, but that they're also both feel one and the same, and as if they're one gesture.
And Stephen, I think along with that, I think it's important to recognize that in reality, a lot of times the base building systems and the exhibit systems are getting installed by different contracting teams.
Yes, that's a good point.
Which really underscores the importance of having our documentation clearly show showing where those demarcation points are so that there's no ambiguity, and everybody knows like where the handoff is to the other one as well. But I think our design needs to anticipate how the project is going to get installed as well. So
a very great point. And the amount of communication that we try to put into our packages that talks about just that, the scope of individual contractors, is really helpful when the bidding goes out.
sometimes we'll do sometimes we'll put a responsibilities matrix like
Yeah.
on our cover sheet or a drawing package, just to kind of to try to instruct that as best we can to help alleviate some of those challenges.
Well, and Tony Reich asks, post-opening maintenance seems to be an important factor in both lighting and AV with museums, and their museums are having less resources to do this in recent years. How do you handle that?
That's a great question. And you know, I'm a huge fan of just because you can doesn't mean you should. And I abstain from saying that when we were talking about smart buildings. I don't, you know, smart building stuff is right for some situations and not for others. And you're absolutely right, Tony. I mean, one of the things when people want to start talking about smart buildings, I'm just using this as an example. You know, it sounds really fascinating, but what they don't realize is what happens after the contractors leave and after the design team leaves and you're left operating the facility. And now what happens when you have one system talking to another one, but the one requires a firmware update and now it no longer talks to the other one? Who do you call? And it's just those kind of challenges that I think as responsible designers, we need to kind of work closely with you as clients to kind of talk through those and to make sure that we're not over designing systems that really aren't practical to maintain and operate.
Absolutely true. Early in the design phases, when we're talking about the complexity of the visitor experience, we will often make sure that everyone understands if we're heading down a road of complexity, interactivity, dramatic or theatrical immersive lighting, those kinds of the artistic words that describe those kinds of experience are coupled with, do you understand the commitment you are making? You might be willing to budget to pay to install this system, but if you're not willing to put into your responsibility matrix as a museum, as an institution, the cost of maintaining these systems, then it's probably better for us not to do it. And I do feel that we take the responsibility to make sure that those conversations happen, so that when you get down the road, it's all of a sudden, oh, well, of course you're going to have to hire, 5 people to work full time on the technology systems. That needs to be part of the discussion very early, so that it's built into the budgeting and the strategy of the building.
Absolutely. Scott Henderson agrees with you. He says, I think when it comes to delineation of base lighting and exhibit lighting systems, it's very important that museum work, that emergency work and circulation lighting are properly delineated in the SOW matrix between those designers. Much like theater, it's really important that we all get to have conversations together. He also noted 2 missing services in the design process are life cycle planning and post-build maintenance contracts. Yep, that's pretty much it.
An interesting thing on the post-build maintenance contracts, I don't know if you're seeing anything similar to this on your side of the work, Stephen, but on the audiovisual side, one of the newer trends, and I would say it's early stages, is contractors are selling AV as a service. We've heard software as a service. A lot of us probably utilize that where we pay a monthly fee. But there are some AV contractors now basically selling AV as a service where they're maintaining your systems on a regular basis to augment maybe your in-house expertise as well. And the interesting thing about that is a lot of times they're also basically leasing the equipment too, which transfers your entire AV expenditure from a CapEx budget over to an OpEx budget, which is it's kind of revolutionary as far as from a budget perspective. So there's some interesting things happening in the industry that definitely worth talking about in the earlier stages of the project.
That is so true. And in fact, Scott, I guess addressed to you, it is very important that those conversations happen before a building goes out to bid, that how the building is going to be maintained. Are you going to get into leasing? Over the last 10 or 15 years, it has become easier and easier for systems to be monitored and restarted, rebooted, repaired remotely. So a lot of times control systems are hooked up to the internet and there's a portal in so that you can, you can get a panic phone call from a client saying, the lights didn't come on. What am I going to do? There's 1,000 kids in the lobby. What do I do? And you can pour it into the system and say, well, it was shut off improperly. Let me just restart the system for you. And so it is great to have those kinds of benefits.
Well, we're wrapping up our questions. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Tony. It was a great presentation from my point of view. I thought it really makes it clear who's doing what, how it works, and the overlap. There's so much overlap. Thank you to everybody who joined us. We will be having another webinar in a couple months, and stay tuned for that. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Trent. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, everyone.